My name is Tamar Hannah from 3x3 Custom, and today I partnered with SawStop to show you how to build this modern curved desk with some pretty cool details like cord management, built-in storage, and even a secret compartment. To build this, I'm going to use the plans that are available to download on SawStop's website. All the information you need, like material list and cut list, is all here. So let's get started with step 1, working on the desk top and side. I purchased rough walnut for this desk, which I milled and ripped to final width at the table saw. But the plans I drew up uses dimensional lumber sizes, so you don't have to mill your own lumber to build this. Because I knew this top would be really heavy, I decided to glue up the top and sides separately. But I wanted to make sure the grain would match, so I labeled the boards for a consistent grain pattern and glued them up. Once dry, I could trim up all the ends and cut them to size. Moving on to step 2, cutting the curve on the desk top. The plans tell you where to place the pivot point for cutting out this curve, which can be done with a jigsaw or a router with a circle cutting jig. Just make sure you drill the hole for the pivot point on the underside of the table so no one will ever see it. I take a few passes with the circle jig, cut out the rest with the jigsaw, then clean it up with a flush trim bit, which is always satisfying to do. The next step is to make the curved leg out of the plywood pieces. I can't fit a full sheet of ply in my car, so the plans are drawn up with convenient places where you can ask your lumber supplier to cut on the panel saw. I started to cut the pieces I need for the next step, but before putting the rest away, I labeled the offcuts with the corresponding letters written on the plan. This way, I know what every part is for, and I won't cut into anything I need. That's something I had to learn the hard way. Anyway, moving along, I followed the cut list diagram to cut the curved supports to size. First, rip to width, then cut to length using the miter gauge with a stop lock on the fence to prevent the pieces from binding. Then, using the guidelines written on the plan, I used a circle cutting jig again to make 2 half circles. These are a bit oversized at this point, so an inch or so gets trimmed off the edge. Now for the fun stuff. Bending wood using a technique called kerf cutting. Kerf cutting is a very simple process. All you have to do is make multiple cuts with your saw to get the wood to bend. The tricky part here is how deep to cut and the distance between cuts. If you don't cut deep enough, the wood won't bend. So test on scrap to get the perfect blade height. As far as the distance between cuts, on the plan I suggest right over 2 inches apart to yield the 180-degree sweep required for this base. But again, test on scrap. If the cuts are too close together, the curve will be too great, too far, and the curve won't be enough. But just around 2 inches and it'll be just right. The idea behind this is very simple and it's easy to do. The hardest part is just lifting up this heavy sheet over and over again to make all the cuts. And then you have to do it a second time on the second sheet. Here's where those half circles cut earlier will come into play. They are simply screwed to the inside of the kerf cut sheets to create the curved shape. These screws will be covered up, so no big deal at all. I countersunk some holes before driving in the screws to make it easier and to ensure the screws will sit below the surface. It's really cool to see the curved shape come together. Then I flipped the whole thing over and repeated the same process to the other side. You may notice here a few extra kerfs cut in my sheet. My bad. This was a silly mistake on my part, but everything is fixable. I ripped some strips of wood to the same thickness as the blade kerf and glued them in place. There was also one extra kerf that was causing the base to be floppy, so I put glue in there and closed it up. Crisis averted. Now for the second sheet. Adding a second sheet just makes this base extra beefy and sturdy. I countersunk holes through the whole sheet, making sure I was drilling in areas where there were no kerf cuts, then added a ton of glue to the second sheet before screwing it into place. The screws here are just acting as clamps because the glue will actually do most of the work to hold these 2 sheets together. I just couldn't find my band clamps. Regardless, these will be easy to fill and cover later. What's great about using screws though, I can continue to work on it while the glue is drying. I flushed up and cleaned up all those filler pieces and used a track saw to trim the back edge to length. As for the front edge, I considered using a handsaw, then realized there are flats created from spacing the kerfs 2 inches apart that I can use to rest a circular saw on. Not a perfect cut, but It'll be covered up in a later step, so no biggie. Now that the curve is built, I can work on the hidden storage. There are measurements on the plans for all these parts, but it's best to measure your actual workpiece to get the most accurate results. I ripped the cabinet sides to width and length, then got to working on the joinery. You don't need to build this cabinet using any of the following joinery methods. This is just how I prefer to build this kind of stuff. You can simply use a butt joint and screw it all together, but when you use dados and rabbets on cabinetry, things just line up really well and the assembly goes really smoothly. Plus, it's fun to use a dado stack. Using a miter gauge and the fence in tandem is not advised for a through cut, but for non-through cuts like these dados, the fence makes a great registration point to accurately make your cuts on all parts. The back of the cabinet will sit in a rabbet, which is easily cut using the dado stack and an auxiliary fence. The cabinet will have adjustable shelves, so it's easier to drill the holes for the shelf pins before it's all assembled. This is done easily by making your own jig to register against the edges of the workpieces. Sides are done. Now the top and bottom of the cabinets get cut to size. Once again, I like to use my actual workpieces to get these measurements. I ripped to width based on the dimensions of the sides, minus the rabbet cut in the back. Then they are cut to length using a stop block on the fence and a miter gauge. So happy I labeled all those plywood parts. I found the piece that was meant for the cabinet back and cut that to size based on my actual cabinet opening. Now you can see how cutting all this joinery makes everything line up really well. Before I can assemble it though, I want to create an access hole in the top portion that will help when attaching the curved base to the desk top. This can also be done with just a jigsaw or a router jig. The next portion is totally optional. I figured since I was making this access hole for mounting, I would utilize that open space to make a secret compartment within the hidden cabinet. Storage inception, if you will. I cut a false bottom to size at the table saw based on the opening cut with the router and rounded the corners until it fit nicely. I'll get back to how this will be installed right after I assemble the cabinet, which goes really smoothly with just glue and screws. Cutting the dados and rabbets takes a little extra time, but totally worth it for the ease of assembly and assurance that it will all be square. Oh, and these screws are going to be hidden inside the table base, so no need to worry about those. Back to the secret compartment. I made 4 of these little triangle blocks and glued small magnets into them. Then I glued and screwed those corner blocks to the top portion of the cabinet, making sure the magnet was exposed in the opening. On the block, I simply placed 4 screws in all the corners and boom, the false bottom stays in place. Now I'll need a way to get it out. So I cut out this circular shape with a router that will act as a key. A magnet gets screwed into the base of the key and another magnet is screwed on the top of the secret compartment. This is where the key will be stored. Next, a magnet gets placed in the false bottom and covered up with a wooden plug, just for a cleaner look. Now the key will be able to release the false bottom. Cool. Okay, enough messing around, back to the build. The hidden storage unit is complete and can be installed into the curved base. Just make sure the edges are all flush and screw it down from the top and bottom. This next part is probably the most difficult, cutting the hidden storage door from the hidden storage front. I chose to do plunge cuts like this at the table saw, which worked out really great, but I totally understand if you're not comfortable with this method. I don't generally like to raise my blade this high, but raising it higher makes for less cutting with a handsaw and less cleaning with a chisel because there's less of a curve attacking the material when it's raised all the way. Alternatively, since this will be painted, you can just make the hidden storage front from 4 separate pieces and hide the seams with filler and paint. Always options. Either way you do it, the process would be the same. Attach the front with glue and brads. Remember, it's going to be painted, so all those holes can easily be filled. Speaking of filling holes, I filled in all the screw holes from the outer portion of the curved base with wooden plugs and cleaned them up with a flush trim saw. As per the design, the curved base will be surrounded by decorative wooden slats, but those slats do not sit nicely on the curve. Easy fix. Just plane down the curved areas to make them flat. Now the slats lay nicely and it's time to move on to paint. I laid out where all the slats would go and then taped up all those areas, Put on 2 coats of primer, sanding between each coat, and then 2 coats of black paint. I know this looks crazy right now, but remember, these blank spaces will be covered with slats. So let's get to making those. We're actually jumping back in time a bit. I milled these slats way in the beginning of this project when I was milling the desk top and side, since I was already in milling mode, but for video's sake, it makes more sense to put this portion here. The desk needs 24 slats, so I ripped them all to width, then cut them to length. I set up a stop block on the fence to cut them to length with the miter gauge, but I wanted to square up one end first, so here's a little trick. Set up your stop block way in front of the blade so you can have room to make a longer cut on one end while still staying away from the fence. Then flip the piece over and square up the other end by butting it up against the stop block on the fence. Rinse and repeat 24 more times. The slats get a very small round over on only 2 of the edges. Notice the painter's tape on one face. It's there to remind me not to round over those back edges so the slats will be flush against the base and prevent any finish from getting on that face, because the finish will prevent the glue from sticking. Back in real time here, time to attach these slats to the base. I peeled away the painter's tape on the back faces and used 2 types of glue. Wood glue for long-lasting strength, and CA glue for an immediate bond to act as a clamp while the wood glue sets up and dries permanently. According to the plans, there's supposed to be a 1-inch space between all the slats, so I used a spacer block when placing them in position. The CA glue sets up in about 10 seconds, so I just had to hold it in position for that long, then I could move on to the next one. Honestly, I thought the stripe look was kind of cool, so if you want to go that way and leave off the slats, there's a ton of ways to make this sort of design work. I cut the back edge a little short on purpose so that I could cover it up with some more wood to create a more seamless edge banding look that I cleaned up after the glue dried. Another optional part of this build, step 7, cutting in the cable management slot. So many ways to cut this out. I chose to make a template and use a router. This is going to be a stepped recess. So the first step, I only made a recess that was about 3/4 inches deep by making multiple passes. Then I could remove the template and cut a rough opening that started about 1 inch from the ends of the recess by drilling a few holes and connecting the dots with a jigsaw. I took some more MDF that was milled to the width of the cut recess and cut them to about 1 inch wide with rounded corners so they sit flush against the ends of the opening. This creates a new edge for me to use with a pattern bit to clean up the rest of the opening. After removing the MDF spacers, you can see how this leaves a lip for an insert to rest on. You can also cut it all the way through initially and glue in blocks to act as spacers. I chose to use dominoes to join the desk top with the desk side, but so many more options here. A miter would be really nice, or box joints, dovetails, you get the idea. If you're planning on using that type of joinery though, remember to add the length you need to cut said joinery. Off camera, I sanded the whole desk to 220, then applied 2 coats of Osmo, always my favorite part. Actually, no, this is my favorite part. Final assembly in the space. I drilled oversized holes into that secret compartment. Then after making sure there was an even overhang all around the sides, I locked it down with screws from the inside. A right angle drill attachment is clutch here. You can also use figure-8 fasteners, Z-clips, or buttons to attach it as well. The downloadable plans have an optional matching rolling file cabinet. All the materials you need and directions to build it are included in the plans, but if you want to see how I put it all together, that full build video will be on my YouTube channel. And it's done. I'm so happy with how this turned out. I love the cable management slot I created. I think it blends in really well with the rest of the desktop, and I love that the wires will be hidden when viewing the desk from the front. I'm also a big fan of this storage compartment. Perfect for storing things like stamps and envelopes. This little secret compartment with the magnetic key is totally not necessary, but it was really fun to make and figure out. My husband really wanted a big, modern, sort of Art Deco executive desk, and he is thrilled with it, so I was really happy I was able to partner up with SawStop to build this for him and share it with all of you. Thanks SawStop for making this build happen, and don't forget to check out the plans that are only available at sawstop.com.